Okay, thanks everyone, welcome. It's an intimate group. First thing I guess I'd like to do is just kind of deputize everyone as moderators. It's sort of a comfortable enough group to do that. And I mean, I should just like get out of your way here. A few initial questions. I mean, I guess what first struck me is, you know, the title of the book is a yes or no question. So which is it?
I didn't ask him to answer that question because you know what my response is going to be. You'll have to read the book to find out.
Okay, well, I read the book, but I won't spoil it. I thought of the title of your book, Damien, in line behind 1 billion people, so I was trying to get on the FDR drive over here. It took some time. Thanks. Let's start with today's news. And today's news in the sort of climate and energy world was the UN annual emissions gap report, which catalogs and accounts for how we're doing year on year. You know, as a multi-decadal trend in carbon emissions. And China is responsible for 27% of the world's carbon emissions. That means there's some way to go. And your book chronicles the journey they've been on, but it's a journey that, is it just beginning? What's the best way to make sense of the 30-year-long history you've written, and the fact that it's responsible, China's responsible, nobody's going to be green until those 27% of the world's emissions are significantly lower.
Well, China is responsible for over a quarter of the world's CO2 emissions every year, although I must point out that their per capita emissions are still less than half of the United States. But nonetheless, there is no silver bullet in the fight against climate change. And we've seen that even as the Trump administration declared its intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, in the United States, cities, state governments, businesses, investors, individuals are all working together to continue where Obama left off. But China, I do chronicle in the book China's remarkable evolution from a country that was widely blamed for the failure of the Copenhagen Summit to reach a global climate treaty to this point today where President Xi Jinping declares that China is a climate torchbearer. And even though there's no silver bullet in the fight against climate change, there is an elephant in the room, and that's coal consumption in China. That's the largest source. Coal consumption in China is the largest single source of CO2 emissions on the planet. So to the extent that China is able, as it declares it wants to do, is to move away from its reliance on coal, that's going to really determine to a large extent the future of our climate fight.
I wonder, and David, just hop in anytime you want. Anything so far? Barbara, you've had such a rich career as starting in our DC's office over there. I was curious about your personal perspective on just the Chinas you've lived through and that have evolved, you know, before your eyes over the course of your career within our DC.
Well, in our discussion this morning, Hank Greenberg said it himself. He says, China is not the country that it was. I mean, he's seen remarkable changes over the many decades. But I've worked in China on China environmental and energy and climate issues for almost 30 years. And in the beginning, we could not even talk about climate. It was so sensitive in China. So when I opened NRDC's office in Beijing in the mid-90s, we couldn't talk about coal either. Coal use in China tripled from 2000, around the time China joined the WTO, until 2013, when the air pollution got so toxic that the Chinese government realized it had to take action. But what we started off working on was energy efficiency, because that was not sensitive. And China's the leader in energy efficiency.
But like literally, you open NRDC's office over there. It's 1991. Like you need an office. Like how do you? I mean, there's not, there aren't a lot of NGOs over there, Western NGOs. Like, what was it like, literally on a sort of day-to-day doing business?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. So I felt very low at the time. I think I was the first Western environmentalist living in China, and I felt very lonely because China was only then beginning to recognize that sustainable development was in its own interest and not applied by the West. And there was, I think, only one other Western NGO in China at the time. That was the World Wildlife Fund, working to protect the panda. So when we started working on clean energy, energy efficiency and green buildings, people thought we were investors. You know, we said, let us help you renovate this building to be a model of green building. There were no green buildings in China. And they kept waiting for the check. Okay. I mean, there were no Chinese NGOs at the time in China. It was a very foreign concept. So actually, we worked in China once I started for NRDC. I had worked there previously about 5 years for the UN Development Program. But when I started NRDC's China program, I worked 10 years before we actually opened a physical office. So I used to joke that our office was one guy with a cell phone. It was hard.
And so in that first period in the 90s, so you get there, you set up the Rio 1992 conference happens next year. This is for people who may not know, the big 1992 environmental conference where nations created what's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Yeah, which to this day and through next week governs the annual climate talk. You have Kyoto negotiations '97, I think. But from your point of view, what were the big plot points for that first stage of your career over there?
Well, I had already been working at NRDC for almost 10 years as a litigator before I moved to Beijing, and I had trouble finding work there. But I basically snuck into a conference where Li Peng was speaking and bringing together a group of developing countries to work out a joint strategy for negotiating the climate treaty. And at that conference, I met the head of the UN Development Program in China, and he figured I must have been important to be at that conference. So I got a job the next day. And the big plot point for me was UNDP supported China in preparing to participate in the Rio conference. I mean, they had boycotted the Stockholm conference 20 years earlier. And after the conference, I was the one, actually, I suggested to the UN team that they work to help China implement this thing called Agenda 21, Sustainable Blueprint for Sustainable Development in the 21st Century. Every country that participated in Rio agreed to do that, but with UN's help, China was the first one to complete it. So I got to be on the front lines and interviewed every one of China's government agencies and all their government-organized NGOs and all the journalists, media, and everybody to find out what they thought China needed on sustainable development. And many of the people I met went on to be leaders in implementing that policy, leading climate change negotiators over the years, leading experts on energy and other forms of sustainable development. And then after that, I got to work with them to try and implement that very ambitious sustainable development blueprint.
The way you describe it in the book is, even like in the 90s, China wants to sort of bring its legacy, again into the national stage. Very much a theme we still see, today. Like when did it become clear to you, A, that like China was going to be the biggest thing that ever happened, you know, and B, that being the biggest thing that ever happened was going to have these environmental headaches?
Well, I had a feeling in the mid-90s that China was going to be key on the issue of climate change. So when I went back to NRDC, and I knew that NRDC had a lot of expertise that could help China to cut its CO2 emissions. So I wrote a memo to the head of NRDC, and I said, we really have to have a China program. This is 2000, excuse me, this was 1996, that's right. I said, China is going to overtake the US in greenhouse gas emissions in 2040.
And when did that happen?
It happened in 2006. So I was on the right track, but way off the mark. And everybody is. Nobody knew how fast things were going to change because of China's meteoric economic rise and that business, the economic development model, which Damien's going to talk about, based on heavy industry, powered by coal.
Well, David, why don't you give us your thoughts just on, and you know, sort of your sort of historical narrative as you see it of this period we're talking about, the sort of the rise in the 90s.
Sure. I'll make just a couple of simple points, and hopefully they come out semi-coherently. The first one is when you talked about, kind of the size and impact of China, and also when it comes to U.S. and China, there was obviously a lot of hope a few years ago that if there was ever going to be a G2 on anything, it was going to be on climate, U.S. and China. But it turns out now we're pretty much just a G1 on climate change. And it's not necessarily, I would caveat it by saying it's not necessarily China deliberately wants to lead, obviously it does, but simply because of the size and its impact and its footprint, whatever it does, it's going to lead anyway by default. Because it is a $13 trillion economy. If it does certain things correctly in the right sequence and with the right pacing, it is absolutely going to lead just by doing these certain things. And what are these things? Well, I would say that the macro trend to really understand for the last 15 years was an industrializing China. From maybe 97 to about 2013-ish. If you got that trend right, then you would have really understood the kind of impact China would have on the environment, on climate, on a host of things. Let me just give you two statistics to illustrate what an industrializing China was like. So in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping launched reform and opening up, China was about 3 to 4% of global steel production. Today, China is 50% of world production of steel. Okay, and even more mind-blowing statistic. From 2011 to 2013, in 3 years, China used more cement than the United States did in the entire second half of the 20th century, in 3 years. Okay? So those two statistics illustrate the kind of the industrialization that took place, particularly after China entered the WTO in 2001. We're now going forward, the biggest macro trend to understand China is what does a post-industrial China look like? How does it manage that transition? And what does it mean for the environment? What does it mean for climate? What does it mean for energy consumption around the world? If you cover markets like oil, coal, that's going to have an impact on commodity prices because a lot of that was driven by the industrializing China for the previous 15 years. If you think about, everyone probably knows the acronym BRIC. Well, there would be no BRIC if there was not a C. China was the one.
It would be the BRI, in fact.
Yeah, it would be the BRI. But if you think about why was Brazil included? Because Brazil exported all the commodities that China needed. Why was Russia included? Because it was exporting all the oil that China needed. India was a little bit of an exception there because it was a big market. But BRICS would not have happened without the last 15 years of Chinese industrialization, which led to a lot of impacts that we see on the ground. Now, what does that look like for the next 15, 20 years? That's really hard to say, and we can talk a little bit about what are the possible risks, what are the possible opportunities, but I think that's the macro trend. People need to understand that China is in the middle of this massive transition. We don't really know how it's going to end, and I personally think it's always the best kinds of stories are the ones that you have that you can take part in actively shaping. So, we can try, NRDC has been trying to do that, and the Paulson Institute has been trying to do that in our modest ways, but I think understanding that is going to have a huge, you'll have to approach China in a very different way, because it's just not going to be, the China that you saw for the last 15 years. Things are already happening, particularly as, when Xi Jinping came to power. You can say a lot of things about what he did right or wrong. One of the things he really fixated on was the environment, and so they've made some meaningful progress there, and we can see it also in the air pollution data as well, that nobody thought they could clean up the air in Beijing. But they've made tangible progress in the last 5 years since their apocalypse in 2013. And they haven't really compromised GDP growth that much in cleaning up Beijing's air. So that I think is a really interesting framework to think about what a post-industrial China look like. We've seen it in the United States. We've seen what Pittsburgh has done, going from a steel town to what it is today. But if you think about the cement statistics, the steel statistics, those are the companies, the players that drove the growth model. So what's going to happen to the equivalent of Pittsburgh in China? What's going to happen to the equivalent of West Virginia in China? Coal town. Shanxi province, you see the map back there, Shanxi province. What's going to happen to those places? They're looking at millions of jobs potentially lost. So the point is, you can't really talk about climate change also in the abstract. It has to be anchored to domestic economics. And the Chinese, just like Americans, care a lot about jobs and economic growth. So a lot of these things are in play, and China's doing more than we are. But I think there's also a lot of cleavages that could potentially happen in China going forward.
It's interesting to think about a model of environmental change in Beijing, particularly through the lens of NRDC. We're sort of help invent the model in the United States, and we have a model in the United States is, depending on who's in power, somebody issues a regulation and then pursues everybody, and then, 8 years later, there's some sort of rule. How do you characterize any analogous model for change that's emerged, even in the last few years in China?
Well, it's interesting. So just to take the ideas, just to take your example of implementing or developing regulations. So the first project we did was in Chongqing to help them. We managed to convince them to develop China's first energy efficient building code. And so we gave them some advice, and then they said, okay, we're going to draft something and then show it to you and get your detailed comments. So we brought together a very large delegation of experts who had developed building codes in the United States, leading jurisdictions, and we trooped over to Chongqing, got in the conference room, and there was the model, there was the code, one at every seat in the conference room. And I looked at it and it said, final. I said, what happened? I thought you were going to show us the draft. They said, we can't show the draft to final. Draft legislation to foreigners. So we got the legislator to enact it yesterday so we could show it to you. Now, so we were there, we commented on it, and it then became a model for the entire Yangtze River climate zone. So it didn't go to waste. But contrast that with, I don't know if it was 10 years later, we went to a conference on, I think it was developing public participation regulations in China. And the expert from what was then the Ministry of Environment was up on stage, and he had one of these machines where he could write on it and it would be projected overhead. And he was taking comments from the audience on changes to the draft regulation and putting it in to the language as we spoke. And so I can't imagine a more, surprising development to me of, and I went to another conference where China a few years ago was planning to develop a national energy law, and they invited experts from all over the world and all the multilateral banks. And we sat around a room again and they took everybody's comments. And I thought, can you imagine the United States? We have notice and comment. And yes, NRDC is always very involved in commenting. But since when would the US government invite experts from all over the world, including China, to come and comment on our draft regulations?
Well, I'll just add to that. I think that model is the way Barbara described it is absolutely right. But I think it's interesting to think about the difference, the contrast between basically a top-down versus a bottom-up. Let's not use words like authoritarian or democratic, but in terms of policy making, it's top-down versus bottom-up. And I think they're both have advantages and disadvantages. The Chinese top-down model, it's very good at deploying resources and capital around a very concrete goal. Things like EVs or solar panels. And in fact, you can almost correlate kind of industry growth versus policy pronouncements. Sort of there's a bit of a lag, but you can see as soon as the Chinese government, they're obviously big fans of top-down industrial policy. Once they support an industry, you can kind of trace the growth of that industry. In solar, for example, I'll give you an example. I was doing research on the ground in Inner Mongolia. I was actually looking at coal, but I happened to run into a solar company that was in the middle of coal country in Inner Mongolia, and I said, well, I was like, you're solar? They're like, actually, 6 months ago we were a coal company, but the government said we should be solar now, so we imported a bunch of stuff from Germany now, and our benefit is that we have our coal mine in the back, so we can supply our own power to produce the solar panels. That's a coal-powered power plant. And then I was like, oh, so are you selling this domestically? They're like, no, they're like, no, it's all being exported to Germany. So they're importing Germany.
What year was that approximately?
What's that?
Do you remember what year that was?
This was 2010, 2011-ish. And so they were importing European, machinery to make the solar panel. Once they're made, they're exporting the panels back to Europe at a cheaper cost. And so there were a lot of these firms that basically went from an incredible stat. I think a few years before that, there were something like 20, 30 solar firms, went up to about 900 in 2 or 3 years. EVs as well. Right now, there are 200 plus EV companies, startups in China. The government only wants 20, but they got 10 times more than they wanted. So, auto sector, is this place that the government has tried to consolidate for years and years without success. So the point is that top-down model is great at deploying capital behind a goal, but the bottom-up model is better for self-correction. Because once if you make a mistake with the top-down model, it's a lot harder to correct, and you have to take your losses. Fortunately, in China's case, a lot of that is state-backed and supported, so you get the state to take on the losses. Here, the government's not going to take on the losses. So with the bottom-up model, you tend to be, slower. Sometimes it just doesn't work at all. But at least when you do get something out, you're probably getting a pretty ideal, policy rather than the other one. So that's just my 2 cents.
So I want to follow up on that and put this in the global climate context with solar panels and with EVs. Yes, this has been a top-down approach of China. They recognize an opportunity that other countries have not been able to fully capitalize on, even though the United States developed the first solar panel and the first working electric vehicle. So what China has done is identified these both as strategic industries and poured a tremendous amount of money into them, and mostly in subsidies. For the solar industry in the past decade, it's an estimated $46 billion. Most of that in subsidies, but also research and development. In the electric vehicle market, it's $58 billion that China has poured into this. Now, yes, they're making mistakes and they're trying to pick winning companies, but to me, the most important point from a climate perspective is that China's massive investments have brought down the cost of solar panels worldwide by 70% in the last decade. And now they're doing the same thing with electric vehicles, because the battery is the most expensive component, and China is building giga factories to produce these electric vehicle batteries, and they've already brought the cost down 2/3 in just 5 years. So what's the impact here? The impact here is that Bloomberg, in particular, their new energy finance, estimates that solar power may become the cheapest source of electricity worldwide in as little as 5 years. And with electric vehicles, right now, solar panels, solar power, and electric vehicles are only like 2% of their global markets, but electric vehicles may become cost competitive with the traditional gasoline engine in 8 to 10 years. Now, why is this important to me, and I think to all of us? This new report by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out a few weeks ago, and they said it's a lot worse than we thought. We really have to limit the rise in global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, not the 2 degrees that was the main focus of the Paris Agreement. And to do so requires a fundamental transformation throughout the world in the way that we obtain and use and store energy. And this could never happen if it wasn't for these massive investments by China, the world's largest investor in renewable energy.
It was such an important moment in the book that's like, it's sort of quick, but like I read this paragraph literally 3 times where it's 2008, the West is sort of eating itself, and China like redirects its suddenly failing solar industry, which has no external customers anymore, to just make a domestic market. And like, it's just like historical significance of that. What at least you presented as this sort of, well, we got to do something. And here it's 10 years later, and because of that, they had to do something with their failing solar industry. It's changing the world at a fast clip. And I just like, of all the moments in the book, that one struck me as particularly, I don't know what you call it. What's the right adjective for, like the Great Recession prompting several years down the line this energy revolution? It's very interesting.
And it illustrates how everything that China does on climate negotiations, on these strategic industries, is always in its own personal, country's self-interest. It's just that China has redefined what is in the country's self-interest to include sustainability and clean energy to the benefit of all of us.
You're going to help out, but I want to point you, if I can, with the question is like, is it fair yet to call China sustainable again if 27% of global emissions are coming from it? Like, at what point do they get to say, yeah, we're sustainable?
I'll address that question, but I think to Barbara's point, as an economist, I think she's completely right. You would want prices of these things to drop globally, right? If you think about it as a public good, that's lower solar panel prices, great. Lower EV prices, lower battery costs, that's great for the world. But funny, I had the same exact debate at another talk with somebody, and I couldn't convince that person why this was good for the U.S. manufacturing. Right, so when you come down to our current political climate, there's a lot of problems. People think, well, China's just exporting cheap solar panels. Swap out the product. It could be cheap anything because that's what China's good at doing. Fortunately, I would agree as an economist that's a good thing, but it's not necessarily uniformly good for a lot of different people. And I think that's partly kind of reflective of kind of general globalization, right? The benefits are diffuse, the costs are very concentrated in very specific industries. And people only notice the concentrated costs right now and don't tend to really understand the diffuse benefits. People don't really understand, you go shopping at Walmart, why that matters to you, why the China price matters. So China price is still associated with kind of cheaper consumer goods, not really associated with solar panels and EVs. And so I think, it's interesting to kind of bring that in, because I had the same exact debate and I just couldn't convince them that this benefits consumers, that most of the jobs in solar in the United States is in services, not in manufacturing. But when you're standing in front of a manufacturer, you don't see that as a varnish to it. You see that as a total negative. And and the current administration also apparently sees that as a negative right now. So just wanted to add that point.
I want to talk about money, and like a lot of, I find, particularly as a journalist and trying to understand this stuff, and I don't have a background in this, as we discussed, I find I lack, and many Americans around me lack, just an understanding of like Chinese finance, and like you have these banks and they put money out, and there's these state-owned enterprises and they take the money and they have their own and government-guided priorities, correct me at any point. And on top of that, we're supposed to get like the new clean industrialization and new finance to enable it, like green bonds. So it's a lot to unravel, but what do we need to know about the Chinese finance model in order to be able to understand what the prospects are for, really dramatic change?
Okay, I'm happy to take a shot at that. I think in short, the Chinese financing system, it's a very bank-centric system. They're currently trying to diversify into different financial products like bonds, securities, and so on. But traditionally, it's been a very bank-centric, meaning dominated by the 4 major state-owned banks and their branches across China. The best analogy I can think of is really to think of the bank system as kind of a fiscal instrument by another name. Because yes, while they're commercial, while they do want to make profit, they have listed arms in Hong Kong and other places, ultimately, they are controlled by the state. Ultimately, they're controlled by the Communist Party, so they need to do certain things that serves state objectives. So the way I talk about it is that in times of shocks, economic shocks, these banks act as shock absorbers, which we do not have in this country. Well, we went through a financial crisis and we don't have those shock absorbers. That's partly because, the state doesn't really own banks in this country. So, but China knows that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the state, in the bank-centric model, and a lot of the clean energy financing is actually coming from the private sector, private equity, venture capital, private companies. So that area is actually a lot more vibrant and dynamic. But obviously, when you have these huge behemoth banks, they are competing a lot with private capital, and in some cases squeezing out private capital, even though they don't necessarily have the expertise to invest in clean energy or other areas. So it's a constant competition, but China is trying to move away from that model. And I think in the clean energy sector in particular, you're going to see a lot more interesting stuff happening in kind of the private PE, PC area, including foreign capital, that frankly, the state banks just don't really know what to do. But then again, Barbara knows this better than most people. I mean, you have something like State Grid, which has their own financing. They control 90% of China's transmission, so they're basically a monopoly, and so they have endless money, and they can fund all kinds of stuff, and they can squeeze out private capital. So fundamentally, it's a constant contest between private and state capital, and whoever wins is not clear yet. And I think in this current cycle, we're seeing a lot more use of the bank as a fiscal instrument rather than a commercial entity.
What is this cycle? What do you mean?
Under President Xi
Okay.
Jinping. Yeah.
And so, what's the role? How big a role in that scenario are green bonds? And why do we need green bonds versus just bonds?
They're very small right now, so they're just. It's a nascent thing. China has to get. China does not have the. They have to set up the institutional ecosystem to actually be able to legitimately create bond products that are credible. I don't know if people know anything about kind of their credit rating system or bond ratings firms, or they're just nobody trusts them. They always give out whatever AAA, triple, whatever, and so it's a very nascent market. But I think, I don't know if Barbara's going to talk about why, because I know you have a huge chapter in the book about it, so.
Well, once again, like with EVs or solar that started out so tiny, I urge you to watch this space, because China only developed a green bond market 2 years ago, and already it's the second largest in the world. And yes, their own credit rating system is, not something you want to rely on, but there are a lot of international eyes on this who are looking carefully at those bond investments to see if they really meet international criteria for green bonds. And it's kind of interesting to me because, as I've heard it explained, some of the bonds are used to upgrade and clean and make coal plants more efficient. I mean, that doesn't cut back on CO2 emissions, but it sure does cut back on pollution. So that is a very important priority in China, and actually air pollution, one of the 3 tough battles that they talk about in China. But even if you take away those type of not so green bonds, China is still the second one in the world. But again, it's just like solar and EVs. You see how fast these new products are growing, but they're still just a tiny percentage of the total. So everything needs to be scaled up, including the green bonds. And that's because when this new UN report estimates that the world will have to invest $2.4 trillion a year on low carbon technologies between now and 2030 to give us a chance of avoiding the worst impacts of catastrophic climate change. That's a 7-fold increase from what was spent last year. So governments can't provide all of that. So something like green bonds, the intention is to mobilize private finance in that direction to help fill that gap.
Yeah, I agree. I think the greatest thing about China right now is its willingness to experiment with these ideas, these things that I think once it takes hold, they just kind of go for it. And they come out with pilots, they do a lot of pilots, they love piloting things. I mean, the entire trajectory of Chinese growth was about piloting special economic zones back in the 1980s. So they're very familiar with piloting, just kind of experimenting with it. Same with the carbon market, right? Small, not quite formed, but they're willing to go for it. So I don't get that similar sense in the United States right now, in part because of our own politics and so on. But so I think that advantage for China is tremendous.
Yeah, someone called it the amazing sheer entrepreneurial zeal of the Chinese solar companies. We don't really see that in the United States right now, but it's very much alive and well in China. It's kind of fun.
How much are best practices, particularly in terms of rolling out new technologies to large amounts of people, how much of that is exportable to parts of the U.S. where there is a lot of interest, New York State, California, probably a couple other places?
You mean export U.S. best practices?
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking about, when all there's dozens and dozens of cities around the world who work together, and even though they have very different, governance and social systems, they still find ways of, like, oh, that worked for you? Well, that could work for us, whether it's in, economic reforms that need to be undertaken, in Beijing, or, I don't know what. Maybe it's a dumb question.
No. Actually, that has been a major focus of the efforts of my organization in China. We now have 50 people in our Beijing office. But for many, many years, that transfer, sharing of best practices was one way. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times we brought experts from California, from New York, from other leading, thinkers and doers on these issues to China, and bringing Chinese over on study tours, which I initially thought was a waste of time, but it really does matter to see these U.S. experiments and practices in person. And actually what often would happen is the Chinese delegation, what made the biggest impact on them they would tell us, is breathing the clean air in the U.S. Now the transfer is both ways, is two ways, and I think it's just really important, especially now with the. And I should say, another intriguing development to me is even though the Trump administration cut almost all of the climate cooperation, there was a climate change working group with like 10 different substantive areas where the two countries were working together. They refunded, and the U.S. Congress refunded recently something called the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center for another 5 years. This is jointly funded by both countries. It brings together groups of researchers and companies from both countries to work together on joint research in 3 areas. One is electric vehicles, one is carbon capture and utilization, and the other is green buildings. NRDC is a member of the Green Building Consortium, and they developed a joint protocol for sharing the intellectual property that's being developed under this. So I'm very interested that the current, U.S. federal government sees the value in that, and it is continuing. That's a sharing of best practices in another way.
Mhm.
That's key. I mean, the IP, kind of coming in with a new IP model is going to be so important, because that's at the heart of kind of curbing U.S.-China economic tensions as well. But were you asking about any technologies that the Chinese were exporting, or just on the energy and climate side?
Really, I guess I was thinking about sort of human collaboration, institutional collaboration, more than specific things.
I mean, you would know a lot more than I do. Perhaps in third countries, maybe?
I just have to tell you a story. We worked in setting up this China-U.S. Energy Efficiency Alliance, another NGO that I started. And around the time of the California energy crisis, we brought the leading commissioner of the California Public Utility Commission, responsible for energy efficiency, to China, to Jiangsu province, to talk about what California had done to deal with this crisis. And the vice president of the state grid flew to Jiangsu to meet with her. He wasn't really interested about energy efficiency. He wanted to know how to avoid a similar energy crisis in China, in which, of course, the Pacific Gas and Electric went bankrupt and prices to consumers were up by 400%. He was very nervous about that. That's a personal impact, and she shared a lot of her thoughts with him. He says, what China needs is its own Susan Kennedy. She went on to be chief of staff for Arnold Schwarzenegger. Anyway, that kind of human interaction is just so important from my experience.
How is Belt and Road Initiative has obviously been focusing a lot of attention this year, in particular. But how is someone who's interested in sustainability and green energy supposed to look at those largely 20th century looking infrastructure, energy intensive projects, and reconcile it with the green push?
Okay, I'll try. So, President Xi Jinping has said that he wants this massive Belt and Road Initiative, which is will be the largest infrastructure investment program in the history of the world. He wants it to be green and low carbon. And China's developed guidelines for those overseas investments, and they are in the process of implementing those through, as we understand, it's a mandatory operational requirements. But it hasn't happened yet. There is a difference between the aspiration and the reality here, in that China, over the last few years, has been the largest investor in coal plants overseas. And they're not alone. Japan and Korea are also right behind them, and the U.S. wants to be as well. I think if this continues, and Chinese experts recognize that it could just completely lock in massive high carbon infrastructure for decades to come and make it nearly impossible to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot of concern on the international front. The good news is, as I said before, the costs of solar and wind are plummeting to the point where they are increasingly becoming competitive with coal. And as the energy storage part of the equation makes it possible to use these plants, not just when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but any time, I think we're going to see that equation change, because as some people say, the Belt and Road Initiative is technology agnostic in some respects. Whatever these countries want, we'll give to them. I think that's not completely true, because as the coal companies in China get squeezed out, they're very interested in looking for opportunities overseas. But the opportunities here, the World Resources Institute just came out with a study where they looked at the pledges of 70 countries, both developed and developing and emerging economies, and what did they make pledges on under the Paris Agreement. And they found that if you add those together, there is a $6 trillion opportunity to help those countries reach their Paris pledges through green technology. They don't want fossil fuel technology. This is the opportunity I think China should be looking at in this Belt and Road Initiative.
I would just add one avenue to kind of work in this area to think about greening the investment and financing is to actually, work with one of the lending institutions that's part of this, something like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which politically we had a lot of problems with when it was first launched. But by all counts, they're behaving and they're being set up like a very legitimate multilateral lending institution. And they're hiring like crazy, by the way, so there's actually an opportunity to actually work within the AIIB if you want to shape it. They're behind the scenes, I've heard from U.S. Treasury folks that despite the political rhetoric publicly, behind the scenes the United States had a very, very deep interest in working with them in shaping how they set up their standards, lending practices. So we were actually quite involved in AIIB's creation. And so they are hiring, a lot of people they have are straight out of the World Bank, ADB, so there's a real opportunity there to, if you think about, this thing's capitalized now, I think something like $300, $400 billion. So they have a lot of money to play with, and a lot of that money could go to, they can either go to carbon intensive, infrastructure or more green infrastructure. And, I think it's great to get on a ground floor, and like I said, to try to shape it in some way, in whatever way you can, to kind of make sure that their standards adhere to best practices.
Happy to take questions from the audience.
Yes, I have a
Go ahead
question.
and introduce yourself first.
I'm Sarah Miles Williams. I have a question about how this huge capacity of cheap solar panels is now being deployed in China. I just got back from China, and I was in Datong and Taiyuan and Luoyang. These are not very big cities in China. By our standards, they're huge. And there were massive developments, and they were not ghost developments. According to the locals, everyone had bought these units. They've been pre-sold. Everyone's moving in. I didn't see any solar panels on them. Now, I'm no expert. So what are they doing with all these solar panels in China? And then there's a related question, which is, do you ever get to the real, vector at all in terms of utilizing solar if you don't have storage and distribution? I mean, isn't that what we lack now in the world, is storage and distribution? So, I mean, when can solar really take a bite out of their coal? I mean, I didn't see any solar, in any of these new buildings. I mean, if you put it on the outside, it wasn't there, right?
All good questions. So most of China's solar development is in very large utility scale solar farms. I mean, there's one that opened recently in the Tibetan Plateau that had 4 million solar panels. So that's where you're seeing the development. What you're talking about is solar on roof, although China also leads the world in solar water heaters, but that's not using the panels.
Right.
What they call solar panels on roof is distributed generation. China really is lagging far behind in that. What most you'll see is big shopping malls or industrial buildings where they have that scale, putting solar on roofs, but on people's homes, they're not nowhere near. I mean, their goal for solar development in the 13 5-year plan was 100 gigawatts of new utility scale solar and 5 gigawatts of this distributed generation. And then they had to take that away, the distributed energy target, because they weren't even close. But they have smashed that 100 gigawatt target already 3 years ahead of time. And now they're talking about increasing the 2020 target to 210 gigawatts or even 270 gigawatts. That's like 5 times the amount of solar capacity that we have in the United States. But I should say also, the second part of your question is when is it going to really make a difference on coal? Even before you address the storage issue, there's a real problem of how much of that solar and wind is actually reaching the grid for a variety of reasons. Because a lot of the rules are set up, the whole Chinese power sector was built upon making sure that coal could be used quickly and reliably so that you could build incentivize people to build as many coal plants as possible. Those rules are hard to change. They're talking about changing. They're doing a whole, number of things to try in terms of power sector reform to guarantee that the solar power and the wind is actually used. But there's resistance from the coal industry, from local governments that don't want power from other provinces, whether it's renewable or not, and from the state grid that doesn't want to deal with renewable energy. So that curtailment problem is huge. They have to deal with that as well. But I think on the storage side, I talked about the battery production. Well, the batteries for solar are also being developed really, really fast. And there's also a very interesting option we've been working on in China, is actually as China tries to scale up its electric vehicles, I mean, it has 1 million on the road right now. They want 5 million in 2020. They want 7 million in 2025. There's only like 3.7 million electric vehicles in the world right now, but they're moving really fast. There is this opportunity to use the electric vehicles as battery storage, manage the charging so that you can store the energy from renewable energy. So there's really interesting options here for really bringing that solar and wind to the point where it can compete with coal, but it requires a lot more flexibility in the grid system that every country is struggling with right now.
So another dynamic in that's playing out very similarly to the United States is that I think the competition right now currently is really the renewable guys versus the natural gas people in China. And that's a very similar thing that's happening in this country, right? Because natural gas is cleaner, not carbon free, but this gets into, I don't want to get too much into the details of bureaucratic interests, but the natural gas is the same as the oil companies, they're state owned. Renewables, as we said, is predominantly private interests. So now you have that dynamic going on in China right now. The 3 national oil companies are huge, extremely powerful, and they're obviously pushing gas. And they're building pipelines to Myanmar, Russia. They're all in on gas, and all of them want to become basically natural gas companies because they don't see a future in oil. But so I think right now it's coal without subsidies. Coal is by far still the cheapest. For sure. So, in terms of cost parity, it's still natural gas versus, renewables, and that's happening in China, and it's obviously has a lot of politics behind it, interest-driven politics.
There's a question over here.
I'm PK Chang. I work in the New York office of Zhongmen Law Firm. It's one of leading law firms in China. I watched the documentary Under the Dome on the internet, and you know, it's as good as Al Gore's, but I know it was taken off after a few days. So I always wondered what's happened to the announcer, the people that were interviewed. Are they still in making statements? Have they been shunked, detained, or I don't know whether it just as an indication of the political atmosphere.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anyone's.
Tell a little bit about Under the Dome, because a lot of people might not know
So
about
this
that.
was a documentary by, spearheaded by a woman who had been a CCTV announcer. That's right.
Chai-Ling, yeah.
That's right. And it was,
Not Chai-Ting.
Chai-Ting,
yeah.
maybe you should tell everybody this. It became immensely popular in a very short time, and then the government took it off the air. I think they were perhaps a little afraid of how fast it went viral. I haven't heard anything since then. I'm not aware of anyone who's been detained. And in fact, some of the government officials who were interviewed, they're still working, still doing what they can to clean the air.
So I have a very interesting anecdote specifically on this particular question. So one of my colleagues right now at our think tank, he was previously a journalist working in Beijing, and he was at, China has the annual National People's Congress. And after that, the premier always takes the Q&A from the media, foreign and domestic. So he was one of the foreign press that was in the room, and you obviously have to clear questions with the people, and he had a list of 5, one of which was about the dome, specifically about pollution, and he was certain that they were going to not let him ask that question because it was too political. It was right after it tore off, but to his surprise, they said definitely ask the one about Under the Dome. So he was the one speaking, and man, you could see him. There's a clip of him asking Premier Li Keqiang about Under the Dome and about that, and he, Premier gave a answer that he had prepared for. I think the context was, you have to realize this came when the anti-corruption campaign was at its height, and they were specifically going after the oil and gas guys. And that particular documentary also deliberately painted the oil and gas people as the bad people in kind of causing air pollution. So there was a lot of political layers there that I think, yes, they took it down, but they also, I think, it served its purpose. They probably didn't want 100 million people to see it over a weekend, but I think they knew what they were doing, and they made their point. Or else, I don't think my colleague would have ever been allowed to ask a question like that.
Richard Kaufman, I have a question about the carbon markets. I saw there was a recent announcement, so can you talk about how well that's gone and how much of a centerpiece is it going to be for Chinese policy going forward?
Okay. So probably most of you know that last December, China launched the national carbon market. But it's been delayed. Originally, it was supposed to be much greater in scope, but they decided last year to focus initially on coal-fired power plants, which, if you only consider that one sector, if the carbon market is successful, would make it the largest carbon market in the world. In the US, we don't have a national carbon market. We have California market, we have a Northeast regional market, and then there's a European market. But I haven't even heard the recent announcement. I know that it's going to take a long time, in my opinion, for China, because it's not a market economy, to implement this very much market mechanism, because they have to get the building blocks in place first. The data has to be full, and it has to be real and verifiable. And there has to be a system of tracking those carbon credits so that if somebody buys a ton of CO2 emissions from another company, they want to know they've gotten something for that, and the company has actually reduced its emissions. I think that's part of the reason they decided to focus on one sector first, because it's mostly state-owned. And these are very large power plants, so presumably the data will be easier to obtain. But I think even then, they're having trouble getting the data in place to launch the market. Is that what you're talking about?
That's the market I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They just made an announcement, I don't remember the details in the last week, about volumes, I think, in the market.
So is that data, is that a question of ground sensors? Or like literally who needs to measure what? Or is it a collection issue?
Yeah, so the US has a SO2 emission trading system from power plants, and they require every plant to have a continuous emission monitor on it so they can verify how much sulfur dioxide is being emitted. They don't really have that in China. They're in the process. I mean, they've made a lot of progress since I started working there. But not every plant has a monitor. So what they do is they estimate emissions often based on the amount of coal that's used. And that's difficult too, because if you have control mechanisms, you're not going to have a full correspondence between emissions and the amount of coal that you use. So that's part of the problem too. It's interesting though, as we have the development of satellite systems, what we're finding out, we have a lot more access to data in China. And that's a recent report about how many of the coal plants that the central government has ordered to be shut down in China are still being built by local governments that want that tax revenue, want those jobs. But you can't hide from the satellite here. So that's another new development that is going to play out quite a bit as we go forward.
Bunch of questions over here, and then
So as we know that
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah.
I'm a reporter from China Citizen and as we know that traditional energy industries are dominated by Chinese SOEs as state-owned enterprises, which have lots of vested interests. As you just mentioned, competitions and resistance never disappear. Considering the status quo, how do you think that the private sector and also foreign businesses could possibly spot a niche in new markets in renewable energies and also electricity or transportation? Do you have some advice for them?
Before they get swallowed up by the SOEs, is that yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a very, very challenging environment, and which I think is why the China market is so competitive, because you have to be all the time, or else the SOEs would just come in and basically buy you out or swallow you up. We talk a lot about EVs, but guess who's building all the EV charging stations? State Grid is building all the EV charging stations. There's very little. It's not like Tesla building charging stations. It's the State Grid, so you're gonna have to use State Grid. I think I'll just say this: the state sector will never go away in China. It's China, right? The State Grid, it will be there. The only way to do it is to grow the private sector around it, so that as a proportion of the overall economy, the private sector gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it has been growing. It's only in the last few years it's kind of turned down a little bit, but I think that's just a blip. I don't think the state sector is efficient enough with its capital to be able to continue to plow money into things that it doesn't know that much about, and it's going to be wasting a lot of capital, and that's going to eventually catch up to the state sector. And if you just look at capital utilization between private and state sector, the private players generally stable profits, even in the 2015-2016 downturn, they weather that much faster than the state sectors. So if you're profitable, you tend to be more sustainable, and eventually, I think you will outcompete the state sector. And let's not forget, I mean, the government does want to really reduce the number of SOEs down to like 70 or 80. And they really don't care as much about kind of the local level SOEs, which are 200, 300,000 alone. Those, some of them can fail, some of them can exit the market. So I think once they go through that process with the, a lot of the debt problems right now is on the SOEs. So once they clean that whole thing out, I think you'll see, hopefully, private sector will come back again, because they are about 70% of the economy. SOEs are only about 30% of the economy.
And if I could just briefly add to that, and building on your point about you don't see many solar panels on rooftops, what really jump-started the market in the United States is this new financing model, where a company will come in and say, I'll build solar panels on your roof, and I will lease it from you, and then you can pay me back through your electric bill. These innovative financing mechanisms. Some have said that that's what China needs because these private companies don't have the access to the capital that the SOEs do. But so they're very interested in these new financing models, even crowdfunding. I'm not sure how that would work in China, but that's a possible opportunity for U.S. investors to get involved, and for private companies in China to get a leg up.
There's a woman over here, and then a woman behind you had her hand up. We'll get to everybody.
Sorry, I have a question for Barbara.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Ning Hong. I go to Columbia University School of International Affairs. So what is it like running an e-NGO in China, especially after the new NGO law came out last year? Do you work with any of the local civil society? Have you been running into problems when doing research for your book? Thank you.
We are registered in China under the foreign NGO law. And so what that requires from us, and I suppose for Paulson as well, is you have to find a Chinese government agency to be your sponsor, and you have to report to them on your proposed activities once a year, and then on how you carried them out. So it's a whole different regime for us. We've continued to do our work, and what we're focusing on, actually I should mention, is really helping China to cap its coal consumption. We brought together a group of all the relevant stakeholders in China to really get them to latch on to this idea and promote it internally. And China now has a mandatory cap on coal consumption. Now we've started a similar process with oil cap, bringing the stakeholders together to really first off do the research on what are the needs and demands in China and how can you cut them back. So that has continued pretty much unchanged. We have been working in China for over a decade with civil society, because NRDC, my organization, was founded by a group of lawyers like myself who consider themselves to be lawyers for the environment. And we as a foreign organization have never been able to bring lawsuits in China, and never will, but we've helped to train many Chinese NGOs, not just how to bring lawsuits, but how to use the regulations in China to gain information, how to participate in a very constructive way in the regulation development and implementation and in enforcement. I mean, for many years in China and the United States, we were bringing lawsuits against polluters because EPA didn't have the capacity, and still doesn't, to sue everybody. But in China also, I think there's a growing recognition that NGOs can play a similar role in helping the government to enforce the environmental regulations. I mean, the environmental law, the basic environmental law in China was amended a few years ago to allow Chinese NGOs to bring lawsuits in the public interest on the environment. So that continues as well.
My name's Max. I work for JP Morgan. So since I work in the financial sector, I'm more interested in the financial means to address the global energy issue. And I'm going to pick up on the carbon emission market question. So my question is that, is there any UN initiative or NGO initiative to encourage global instead of a regional market in China of the carbon emission?
There has been discussion about establishment of a global market. It probably would be easier to have a tax on carbon than to set up a trading across between countries. But there's another issue there. I remember discussing this in California a few years back because they have a carbon trading market. People living there in that state, they want to see the cleanup happening where they live. They don't necessarily want to feel that their carbon market is being used to clean up emissions in another country, even though carbon is global. CO2 emissions affect everybody. But there is that issue because often when you do clean up emissions, you're cleaning up the air as well. And people want to see those impacts, those benefits locally. So that's an obstacle to development of a global carbon market, as well as all the logistical and other issues.
So for Paris Accord, for example, is there any section in it concerning the market, the carbon market, no?
I think there's general language in there that supports that, but really at this point, China's the action where it's at, as in so many other things. Everybody, the eyes are on China to see if this national market can succeed. I mean, there were 7 regional markets going on for a number of years. And so there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered based on China's experience with these pilot markets. I have not heard of any other country that's really working on developing its own carbon market right now. Of course, in our U.S. elections recently, the proposal in Washington State to initiate a carbon tax was shut down after heavy lobbying by the fossil fuel industry that's going to oppose any whiff of that kind of development.
There was an interesting factoid in the UN emissions gap report this morning that only 15% of emissions in the world are covered currently by a carbon price. But if China were to implement its nationwide program, that would leap to 20%. So you can see, like, in the world we're in, there's like 15% covered. So to get to like a uniform global is still a long way to go for that to happen.
So I have a question for both, I think for both Damien and Barbara. Barbara, picking up on a couple of things that you said earlier. One was that China always does things that are in its own national interest, and that the definition of China's national interest changed so that they felt that climate was a very important issue for them to tackle, et cetera. The other thing you said this morning was you referred to an epic battle between, I guess it was sort of the development pressures to develop the economy versus pressures to work on the environment, et cetera. It looks like the economy has slowed at this point, and so I want you both to talk a little bit about that epic battle and what, is China, does this commitment to climate and environmental cleanup, at what point does it fly out the window because of needs to, develop the economy, continue pushing economic development?
So first of all, China's definition of its national interest. Its climate actions actually contain within it many other national interests because, first of all, China is one of the countries that's most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They estimate that 50 million people are at risk from coastal sea level rise. Not that China's coastline is any longer than the United States, but it's just so much more heavily populated. And in the Tibetan Plateau, that's the source of 10 of major rivers in Asia, and we're seeing the glaciers melt there and it's causing flooding. And because the glaciers melt, they cause these lakes that then burst. Massive flooding. Just last month, there were 20,000 people who had to be evacuated. And the Chinese average temperature is warming faster than the global average. They've had their warmest summer in the 57 years. So food security, water security, energy security, these are all very important to China. And so also the need to restructure its industrial model. These are all the reasons why, and to address its choking air pollution, the reasons behind China's actions to cut its coal use and its carbon emissions. And again, President Xi has made this a hallmark of his, clean skies, green mountains, whatever, campaign. He really wants to see those blue skies and clear water. I think that's what it's called. Soon. But what we're having now is the economy slowing, as you know, and there's a lot of debate, as I understand it, in China now of how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? And a lot of people are going back to that old economic model because it worked in the past. Stimulus, infrastructure, more buildings that aren't being occupied, And that's, as you said, it's not working as well as it did before. So it is an epic battle of how to make that transition away from a country and an economy that was built on coal. How to make that transition that everybody says they want and that is clearly in China's own best interest. But it's not easy because, as we heard from Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. You want people to have clean air and a better standard of living, but China recognizes it has to keep the economy humming. But this new normal of slower but higher quality economic growth, I think, is the right approach for China. And places like California have shown that it doesn't have to be a choice between environmental protection and economic growth. In fact, that whole concept we talked about earlier of sustainable development is key here, because I think that making that transition to renewable energy, to cleaner transportation, is the way that China is going to get through this economic downturn.
Well, I think you asked a fundamental question, right? It's basically, can a developing country grow and clean up at the same time? And I think it's important to put that in context and be objective about that, because we've never really asked developing countries to do that. Look at our own country, look at many other countries. It's usually you clean up after you've developed. You don't clean up while you're developing. China is still about a $9,000 per capita GDP. Guess which other country is also $9,000 per capita GDP? Colombia. Nobody's asking Colombia to shoulder these global burdens on climate and carbon. Nobody is. So China has a legitimate argument there that we're at $9,000 per capita GDP. Find me another country that's being asked to do that much, right? So that being said, I think China actually recognizes that it's not a typical developing country. It just isn't, right? It can have 500 million people in the middle class and way above $9,000 per capita GDP, twice the U.S. population. And then it's still got 900 million people, nearly 1 billion people that's poor and living barely on $5 a day, so to speak. So China recognizes that. I would just say that I think the priority has absolutely shifted, and what China really needs to do is to overhaul the incentives, the so-called GDP fetish that they've had for about 30 years. Fixating on this macro target has really led to a lot of these problems across the country. And I would venture to make a call that in the next 10 years, the PM 2.5 target is going to be more important than the GDP target. And that is what's going to drive.
The next how many years?
In the next 10 to 15 years, the PM 2.5 target will be more important than the GDP target nationwide. And that is going to lead to some fundamental changes.
Last question. Sorry.
Hi, Walker Cotton. Energy security was briefly brought up. how influential was that in the original motivation to start pushing China to become greener and to develop the way it is today?
It was not as much of an issue as it is now, energy security. And one of the reasons is that a key focus of China now to cut the pollution, particularly in the Beijing region, but now they've also expanded it elsewhere, is the use of coal for heating in people's homes and in small industrial boilers. Now, this is only about 10 to 20% of China's total coal consumption, but it has an outside influence on air pollution, which is about 50 to 65% of that carbon, black carbon and organic carbon emissions. So maybe some of you heard last winter what happened. The Chinese government slapped these huge targets on the regions around Beijing to switch from coal to gas. And they were successful ultimately in doing so. If you look at the total amount of coal that they saved, about 65 million tons, but it was very difficult. It happened so fast that a lot of these towns just didn't have an alternative. The local government shut down, forbade the use of coal before they really had that gas infrastructure in place. So this year, I was wondering if they would continue that switch, but they are. They're doubling down again. Another 10 million people are going to have to switch from coal to gas. So between that big focus and also the growing use of the traditional gasoline engine, China's oil use is skyrocketing. I mean, some estimate that it's adding the equivalent of a medium-sized country in oil demand every year. And the LNG imports went up by 50% last year. So that's what's getting their attention right now, more and more, in terms of energy security.
Thank you very much. Barbara's book, again, is Will Trying to Save the Planet?
We'll try and save.
Will Trying to, I'm sorry, it's, it's, thank you. It's been a long day for me personally. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.